A frayed, wax-sealed envelope landed with a soft thud on the pristine white china, right next to a half-eaten slice of Kahlua pig. The torchlight flickering across the manicured lawns caught the aged paper. 80 faces turned toward the head table in total shock. Just 90 seconds earlier, I was standing in the shadows near the edge of the property, where the light from the tiki torches faded into the dark Pacific Ocean. My name is Elizabeth Gonzalez. I am 29 years old, and I did not come to this celebration to throw a tantrum. I came for a structural demolition. But 90 seconds ago, the demolition had not yet begun. 90 seconds ago, my father Richard had raised his crystal champagne flute at his own 60th birthday luau on our Kona coffee estate. He wore a traditional male lei around his neck and smiled his practiced camera-ready smile. He looked right past the wealthy resort developers seated at the prime tables and aimed his gaze directly at the spot he assumed I was not occupying. He had spent the last 10 minutes talking about the Hawaiian spirit of Ohana, about legacy, and the deep roots of the Gonzalez family. The mainland investors nodded along, sipping their drinks, charmed by the performance. Then Richard lowered his voice to that perfect pitch of sorrowful benevolence he always used when discussing his favorite burden. And to Elizabeth he said, letting the words carry over the quiet strum of a ukulele, "My problem child. Proof that even our greatest mistakes can be taught the meaning of Ohana." The crowd offered a polite, uncomfortable chuckle, the kind of sound people make when they are desperate to ease the tension in a room, but still want to align themselves with the man paying for the catering. I watched the developers exchange approving glances. In their eyes, Richard was a saint, a good man who had taken in the unfortunate result of a youthful indiscretion and raised her alongside his legitimate daughter. He was showing them his supposed moral character, using my dignity as the currency to buy their respect. I stood near a catering station holding a glass of sparkling water and felt the familiar weight of the public shame he expected me to carry. What nobody sitting at that head table knew was the transaction that had taken place exactly 3 days prior. My mother Victoria and my sister Sarah had paid a visit to my laboratory in Hilo. They had handed me a crisp white envelope containing a check for $5,000. It was a clear, unspoken bribe to keep the embarrassing affair child away from the most important business evening of my father's life. They needed the narrative clean for the Pacific Horizon executives. They expected me to argue. They expected me to act like the unstable problem they always claimed I was. Instead, I did something much more dangerous. I played the shrinking, grateful daughter they spent my entire life building. I took the check. I cashed it the very next morning at the local bank. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a gracious handwritten note on thick cardstock. I promised to stay far away in my lab. I told them to have a wonderful evening, and I sent my love. Sending that note felt like putting on the clothes of a corpse. It was the hardest acting of my life. I had to channel every ounce of submission I had learned as a child just to form the letters on the page. But the tactical advantage was undeniable. By cashing the check and sending the note, I gave them the exact version of me they wanted. I let them drop their guard entirely. They stopped looking over their shoulders. They stopped checking the perimeter. They walked into this luau tonight believing they had successfully purchased my absence and secured their perfect, undisputed future. They had no idea I had already kicked the legs out from under their table. The ukulele music continued its soft, rhythmic strum. I noticed I could smell the rich salt and pig fat cooling in the roasting pit, blending with the sweet scent of plumeria in the humid air. I calmly set my glass of sparkling water on a passing waiter's tray. The waiter blinked in surprise, but I was already moving. I stepped out of the shadows and into the torchlight. My heels made no sound on the thick grass as I bypassed the round tables where the guests were just beginning to realize the problem child was walking right toward the guest of honor. I did not rush. I kept my breathing even and shallow. I watched Richard's face as the realization hit him. The camera-ready smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he tried to recover. He assumed I was there to cause a scene to beg for attention, or perhaps to drunkenly embarrass him, just like the stories he told the neighbors. He subtly signaled a security guard standing near the buffet line, but he was too late. I was already at the head table. I stopped right in front of him. I did not yell. I did not cry. I reached into my leather folio and pulled out the old wax-sealed envelope. I placed it directly on his white china plate, right next to his dinner. I used 2 fingers to square its edge against the rim of the dish, the exact way I square a seismograph printout before a briefing. Precision is everything when you are dealing with catastrophic pressure. I looked at the worn paper sitting there, a small faded rectangle, against the luxury of his celebration. I looked up from the plate and met his eyes. The torchlight reflected in his pupils, and in that single suspended moment, I felt the most pathetic crack inside my own chest. As I stood there looking down at the man who had spent 3 decades treating me like a stain, I realized something I hated. A tiny broken part of me still wanted him to look up at me the way he looked at my sister Sarah. I wanted the warmth he reserved only for the people he actually valued. I wanted him to see me, to really see me, and feel a sudden rush of paternal pride. That desperate wanting was a sickness. It was a reflex wired into a child who had been starved of affection her entire life. It is terrifying to realize you still crave the approval of your own abuser. I let myself feel that pathetic hope for one final second, and then I consciously, actively killed it. I watched the annoyance hardening in his jaw and the cold dismissal returning to his eyes, and I let that familiar rejection extinguish the last ember of loyalty I held for him. The wanting was the final chain tying me to this family. Once it was dead, I was free. I let the silence stretch out over the lawn. The polite laughter had long since died away. The guests were holding their breath. The ukulele player realized something was wrong and let his hand fall still against the strings. The silence became a physical weight pressing down on the head table. Richard stared at the envelope and then glared up at me, waiting for the tantrum he was so sure I was about to throw. He had no idea the silence was not a pause before a scream. It was the quiet withdrawal of the ocean just before the wave hits the shore. To understand how I reached that point of freezing calm holding a sealed envelope over my father's birthday celebration, you have to rewind the clock. You have to look backward to the exact moment I learned my designated role in the Gonzalez family. It happened on a sunny Tuesday afternoon during my 9th birthday. The estate was bustling with stable hands and groundskeepers. Richard had arranged a grand reveal for my sister Sarah, who was 11 at the time. She was led out to the front paddock where a trainer handed her a thick leather lead rope attached to a beautiful young chestnut mare. The adults clapped and Sarah beamed, posing for photographs with the expensive living, breathing symbol of our family wealth. I stood off to the side watching the flashbulbs catch the sunlight on the horse's coat. A few minutes later, we sat on the shaded lanai, and Victoria handed me my gift. It was not wrapped in shiny paper. It was a simple cardboard box. Inside, I found a cheap, child-sized geology field kit containing a plastic rock hammer, a flimsy magnifying glass, and a few dusty mineral samples. Tucked under the plastic tray was a small white card. I opened it and read the words written in Victoria's elegant, sharp, cursive handwriting. For a girl who should learn her place is on solid ground. I looked up from the card and watched Sarah feeding an apple to her new horse. She received a creature that elevated her above the earth. I received a box of dirt and a written reminder to stay down. I folded that note carefully and hid it in the back of my sock drawer. I still have it to this day. That note is the entire Gonzalez family dynamic distilled into a single sentence. I took her cruel advice literally. Today, I am a seismologist working at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. I spend my weeks analyzing tectonic shifts, charting the deep underground forces that shape the Big Island, and calculating the risk of sudden ruptures. I read the stress of the Earth for a living. I will only use this comparison once, because the truth is, I did not learn how to measure pressure from a university textbook or a digital sensor. I learned how to read invisible pressure sitting at the polished koa wood dinner table in the Kona house long before I ever stepped foot in a laboratory. Richard controlled the narrative of our household with ironclad discipline. He told our friends, our neighbors, and our estate employees that I was the unfortunate consequence of a brief, regrettable affair he had conducted before marrying Victoria. He presented himself as a noble martyr who had graciously brought his mistake into his home to be raised properly. Victoria played the role of the long-suffering wife. Her coldness toward me was tactical and relentless. She looked at me and saw the physical embodiment of her husband's betrayal, breathing her air and eating her food. She punished me with silence, with omitted invitations, and with the precise way she would pour fresh juice for Sarah and glide right past my empty glass. Sarah was the legitimate heir, the golden child destined to run the coffee empire. I was the dark stain they tolerated out of a twisted sense of duty. There were physical reminders of my isolation as well, small seeds of an unspoken truth that I carried on my own body. Whenever I sat at that dinner table trying to shrink into the upholstery, I would stare down at my hands. I am the only person in the Gonzalez family with a crooked left thumb. The top joint bends at a strange, sharp angle away from the fingers. When I was 7 years old, I held it up during breakfast and asked Richard why my hand looked different from his and Sarah's. He barely glanced up from his morning newspaper. He took a slow sip of his black coffee, flipped a page, and said, "I got it from my mother's side, the unknown woman, the phantom mistress. It was just another physical marker proving I did not belong in their pristine genetic line." Then there was Aunt Rosa. She was the widow of my late Uncle David, who was Richard's older brother. David died in a tragic boating accident when I was just a baby. Rosa remained part of the extended family perimeter, showing up for major holidays and formal estate gatherings. But every time I walked into a room where Rosa was sitting, she would react physically. Her shoulders would hike up toward her ears, her breath would hitch, and she would flinch. It was a sharp, involuntary recoil, followed by her immediately looking away toward the floor or a window. As a child, watching a grown woman flinch at your mere presence leaves a deep psychological scar. I assumed she found me repulsive. I assumed the sight of the affair child disgusted her, just as much as it disgusted Victoria. I spent 29 years believing that flinch was pure hatred. It is a profound tragedy to misread someone's crushing guilt as disgust for 3 decades. Because of that pervasive rejection, I built a belief system just to survive my own childhood. I decided my worth depended entirely on staying invisible. I internalized the lie that I was a fundamental mistake who had to earn the right to share their oxygen by taking up as little space as possible. Survival meant staying off the radar. I found my refuge away from the manicured lawns of the estate. I would take my bicycle and ride down to the black sand beaches of Punaluu or hike deep into the dense green rainforests of the island. The ocean did not care about legitimate heirs. The volcanic rock did not grade me on my pedigree. Nature offered a harsh but fair sanctuary where I was not constantly reminded of my flawed existence. I lived my life adopting a strategy of passive observation. In a household defined by sudden emotional shifts and volatile moods, I made sure I never caused an eruption. I kept my head down. I studied hard. I got my science degree, and I monitored their tempers from a safe distance. I genuinely believed that making myself small and unproblematic kept me safe. But invisibility does not offer safety in a toxic ecosystem. It just provides the predators with a target who will not fight back. Being quiet did not protect me. It merely made me useful to people who constantly needed someone to blame for their own misery. That false sense of security held firm for years until the ground finally gave way. The true structural failure of our family did not happen at the birthday luau with the envelope on the plate. It happened 3 weeks earlier at a mandatory family dinner that forced me to finally look at the fault lines I had been ignoring my entire life. The fracture that eventually brought down the Gonzalez empire began exactly 3 weeks before the birthday luau. It started with a phone call summoning me to a mandatory family dinner at the estate. I drove down from my laboratory near the caldera, trading the stark, cool air of the volcanic summit for the thick, sweet humidity of the Kona coast. The transition always felt like descending into a different world. At the observatory, I was a respected scientist. The moment my tires crunched onto the long gravel driveway of my childhood home, I reverted to the quiet ghost haunting the edges of their lives. We gathered around the massive polished koa wood dining table. The setting was immaculate. Victoria had arranged bird of paradise centerpieces, and the estate staff served fresh mahi-mahi. The atmosphere in the room was highly unusual. There was a crackle of electric anticipation radiating from Richard and Sarah. They exchanged knowing glances, while Victoria maintained her usual serene, detached posture. I kept my eyes on my plate, eating in silence, practicing my lifelong habit of invisibility. I assumed the dinner was a planning session for Richard's upcoming 60th birthday celebration. I assumed we were there to discuss catering options and guest lists. I was wrong. As the dessert plates were cleared, Richard sat back in his heavy wooden chair and steepled his fingers. He looked at Sarah with a glowing pride that I had never once experienced directed at me. He announced that his 60th birthday would mark his official retirement. But he was not simply handing the keys of the coffee estate over to his golden daughter, as we had all expected. Instead, he revealed a much more lucrative exit strategy. He had signed a binding letter of intent to sell 70% of our ancestral land to Pacific Horizon. Pacific Horizon was a ruthless mainland resort developer known for paving over indigenous history to build luxury eco-resorts for wealthy tourists. Richard stated the purchase price with a breathless reverence: $40 million. The developers would bulldoze the old coffee groves and erect high-end villas and private infinity pools. Richard and Sarah were going to split the staggering payout right down the middle, securing their status among the ultra-wealthy elite of the island. The closing date was already set. The grand luau scheduled for his birthday was going to double as the official celebration of the sale. He was going to stand in front of the local press and sign away the soil our family had cultivated for generations. He laid out the financial details while Sarah beamed her eyes, calculating the interest on her future fortune. Then Richard turned his attention to me. This was the moment he could have sneered. He could have told me to pack my bags and stay off his new mainland partner's radar. If he had taunted me, I might have just walked away and never looked back. But Richard was far more dangerous than a simple bully. He used a weapon much sharper than open cruelty. He used generosity. He leaned across the beautiful koa wood table and reached out. He gently patted the back of my hand. The physical contact was so rare it made my skin crawl. His voice dropped into a warm, soothing register, the tone a benevolent king might use when addressing a loyal peasant. "We have set aside a little something for you, Elizabeth," he said, offering a gentle, reassuring smile. "You have always been taken care of in this house. You will always be taken care of. You do not need to worry your head about grown-up things like trusts or land transfers or corporate acquisitions. Just keep enjoying your rocks up on the mountain. We have it all handled." The condescension was perfectly gift-wrapped in paternal care. I looked across the table. Sarah gave me a tight, satisfied smile, her posture radiating victory. Victoria simply picked up her linen napkin and folded it into a neat, unbothered square, not even bothering to look at my face. They were treating me like a beloved, albeit slow-witted family pet who was being promised a new chew toy while the adults discussed the mortgage. The sheer arrogance of it was suffocating. I pulled my hand away from his touch. I kept my voice quiet and level. I asked him what would happen to the estate workers. There were dozens of local families who had managed the coffee plants for decades, people whose livelihoods depended entirely on that soil. I asked him what would happen to the legacy of the land our grandfather had protected. Richard did not get angry. Instead, he chuckled. It was a soft, patronizing sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the dining room. He shook his head as if I had just asked a delightfully naive question about a fairy tale. "Oh, Elizabeth," he sighed, picking up his wine glass. "That is exactly why we handle the business, and you handle the dirt. The market is shifting. We are adapting. The workers will find other jobs. You let me worry about the legacy." The message landed with brutal clarity. I was a dependent to be managed. I was an item on a ledger, a minor recurring expense that they had graciously decided to subsidize. I was not a stakeholder. I was not a person whose voice registered or whose opinions mattered in the slightest. The dinner concluded shortly after that exchange. They returned to discussing the catering menu for the developers, and I quietly excused myself. I walked out to my car, the humid night air clinging to my skin. I drove away from the estate, winding my way back up the dark mountain roads toward the volcanic summit. The drive takes over an hour, and for the first 20 minutes I felt nothing but a numb, blank shock. But as the elevation increased and the air grew thin and cold, the numbness began to crack. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. A wave of physical nausea washed over me, and I had to pull over onto the gravel shoulder of the highway. I sat there in the dark, listening to the ticking of my engine. I realized with mounting horror that the sickness in my stomach was not caused by my exclusion from the $40 million payout. The money meant nothing to me. The horror was rooted in something much deeper and much darker. As I sat there replaying the dinner in my mind, I realized that for a brief, sickening fraction of a second, when Richard patted my hand and promised me a little something, I had felt grateful. My heart had actually leaped at the promise of a scrap. 30 years of psychological conditioning had trained me to view their bare minimum tolerance as a gift. I had been starved of affection and security for so long that I was instinctively ready to lick the hand that threw me a bone. That realization was a third rail to my psyche. It shocked me to my core. I sat in the driver's seat, breathing hard, staring out at the silhouette of the mountain against the night sky. The lie I had lived by, the belief that staying invisible and accepting my lot in life kept me safe, was no longer a comfort. It felt exactly like a hand wrapped tightly around my throat, cutting off my air supply. My gratitude was the very mechanism they used to keep me enslaved. I did not formulate a master plan of revenge right there on the dark highway. It is important to understand that. I was not yet ready to burn their lives to the ground. But I made one single vital decision in that car. I decided I could no longer stomach my own gratitude. I refused to be thankful for the dirt they kicked in my face. I refused to accept the little something they offered to buy my silence. In my profession, we study seismic warning shivers. These are tiny, deep micro-earthquakes that register on our instruments days or even weeks before a main eruption. I teach young interns how to spot these faint fractures in the bedrock because they tell you that the structural integrity of the earth is failing. I had spent my entire life teaching others how to read the warning signs of the ground shifting, but I had never once applied that science to my own life. Sitting in the cold mountain air, I finally felt the internal tremor. The tectonic plates of my own identity were beginning to grind against each other. The pressure was building, and it was pointing me straight toward an old, unresolved memory waiting quietly in a fireproof safe in my closet. A memory of a dying woman, a heavy sealed envelope, and a question I had been too terrified to answer for 11 long years. I put my car in drive and pulled back onto the highway heading toward the truth. The drive from the Kona coast back up to the volcanic summit is a long, winding ascent through the dark. The air grows noticeably thinner and colder with every mile you put between yourself and the ocean. I kept the radio off the entire way home. The sickening memory of my own gratitude at the dinner table kept circling my mind, demanding an explanation. I needed to understand why I was so conditioned to accept their crumbs. That search for an answer pulled a deeply buried memory to the surface. The oppressive atmosphere of my father's dining room transported me back 11 years to a sterile hospice facility in Hilo. I was 18 years old, and Aunt Rosa was dying. Rosa lay in a narrow, mechanical bed, surrounded by monitors that beeped in a slow and steady rhythm. The room smelled of sharp antiseptic masking the scent of fading flowers. Uncle David had been the golden son of the Gonzalez family. He was Richard's older brother, who perished in a tragic boating accident when I was just an infant. Rosa was his widow. Following his death, she had lingered on the edges of our family gatherings for years. She was a quiet, grieving woman who always seemed to shrink into the wallpaper whenever Richard entered a room. On that particular afternoon, she had requested my presence specifically. Victoria and Richard had refused to visit her, claiming they were too busy managing the seasonal coffee harvest. So I sat alone beside her bed, holding her fragile hand. Her skin felt like dry paper slipping over frail bones. She struggled to draw breath, but she reached under her pillow with a trembling arm. She pulled out a heavy sealed envelope. The wax on the back was stamped with a generic, unidentifiable emblem. She pressed the thick parchment firmly into my palm, and her grip was surprisingly strong for a woman hours away from death. She looked at me with eyes that were cloudy, but intensely focused. "I owe you a truth. I was too much of a coward to give you, while it could still help," she whispered. Her voice was barely a rasp against the mechanical hum of the oxygen machine. "Open it when you finally stop believing them. Not before. You will not survive it before." I promised her I would wait. She passed away 2 days later and took her reasons to the grave. For 11 long years, that envelope sat locked inside a small fireproof safe at the bottom of my bedroom closet. I never broke the wax seal. I moved it from college dorm rooms to cheap rented apartments, and finally to my small house near the observatory. It was a silent roommate carrying a weight I was too terrified to unpack. But that night, after returning from Richard's dinner, I walked straight into my bedroom and opened the closet door. I spun the combination dial and pulled the heavy paper from the dark metal box. I carried it into my kitchen. The house was heavy and silent. I turned the knob on my gas stove. A ring of blue fire flared to life, casting long dancing shadows against the wooden cabinets. I held the envelope an inch above the heat. I watched the edges of the thick paper start to curl. The dark wax seal began to soften and weep under the rising temperature. This was the moment the lie I had lived my entire life fought back and won around. I stood in my kitchen and rationalized my own cowardice. I told myself that Richard and Victoria were cruel and manipulative, but they were the only blood relatives I possessed. If I burned this mysterious document, I could pretend the dinner was just another bad night. I could go back to the estate for the luau smile politely and keep my tiny sliver of belonging. I reasoned that opening the envelope might reveal a truth so destructive it would sever my last tie to the Gonzalez name. Being invisible but belonging to a family felt vastly safer than being truly seen and entirely alone. The terror of becoming a complete orphan gripped my chest. My thumb traced the softening wax. I pulled my hand back from the fire. I turned off the burner, plunging the kitchen back into darkness. I walked back to my bedroom and locked the envelope inside the safe. I chose the familiar prison over the terrifying unknown. I let the lie dictate my survival for one more night. I climbed into bed, but sleep was an impossibility. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. The rhythmic clicking sound of the blades sounded like a metronome marking time. My mind refused to settle. I am a scientist. When my instruments pick up a tremor that does not fit the established geological model, I do not ignore it. I run the data until the anomaly makes sense. Lying in the dark, I began to run the data on Aunt Rosa. I thought about her physical reaction to me throughout my childhood. I thought about the sharp, involuntary flinch she exhibited every single time I walked into a dining room or a parlor. For 29 years, I had interpreted that flinch as disgust. I had believed she was repulsed by the sight of her brother-in-law's illegitimate affair baby. But as I mentally replayed those encounters without the filter of my own childhood insecurities, the entire picture shifted. I analyzed her body language, the way her shoulders hiked up toward her ears, the way she immediately averted her eyes, the way she seemed to fold in on herself to become smaller in my presence. That was not the body language of a woman feeling disgust. Disgust is arrogant. Disgust looks down its nose and stands tall. Rosa was looking away. Rosa was shrinking. That was the physical manifestation of suffocating guilt. But why would Rosa feel guilty around me? I sat up in bed and turned on the bedside lamp. I grabbed a notepad and a pen from my nightstand. I needed to write it out to see the variables on a page. Uncle David was Richard's older brother. He was the favored son, the one my grandfather actually respected and intended to leave the estate to. When David died in the ocean, Richard stepped up to fill his shoes and take control of the family trust. Rosa was David's grieving widow. According to the story Richard fed the world, I was born from a brief affair Richard had with a nameless woman shortly before he married Victoria. By the time I was brought into the Gonzalez house, Rosa was already a widow, living on the periphery of the family. I stared at the ink on the paper. The equation was broken at its core. What does a grieving widow owe her brother-in-law's affair, baby? Precisely nothing. She owes me no loyalty. She owes me no truth. If Richard brought home a child from another woman, Rosa's logical reaction should be indifference or perhaps pity for Victoria. There is no social or moral reason for Rosa to harbor a soul-crushing guilt regarding my existence. There is no rational explanation for a dying woman to apologize for her cowardice to a girl she barely interacted with. The math did not add up. I make math add up for a living. And in my line of work, when the math does not balance, it means your foundational assumption is false. The foundational assumption of my entire life was the story Richard told about my birth. If Rosa owed me a profound, life-altering apology, then Rosa was somehow complicit in my suffering. She had witnessed something or participated in something that required a deathbed confession. I looked across the room at the closet door hiding the fireproof safe. The blue flame of the gas stove had not destroyed the evidence. The envelope was still there, holding the missing variable to the impossible equation. The sick feeling of gratitude I had experienced at the dinner table was entirely gone now. It was replaced by a cold, clinical demand for facts. Rosa had warned me not to open it until I stopped believing them. I realized, sitting on my bed in the early hours of the morning, that I had finally crossed that threshold. I no longer believed the benevolent patriarch act. I no longer believed I was an unwanted burden, graciously sheltered by a charitable family. I knew there was a structural lie buried deep beneath the Kona estate, and Aunt Rosa had handed me the shovel to dig it up. The sun was just beginning to rise over the volcanic crater outside my window, casting a pale gray light across my bedroom floor. It was time to retrieve the envelope. I waited exactly 3 days before I touched the envelope again. During those 72 hours, I functioned on autopilot. I monitored seismic graphs, submitted routine reports, and drank bitter coffee in the break room while my colleagues discussed harmless everyday problems. All the while, my mind remained anchored to the heavy parchment locked inside my closet. I did not gather the courage to read it, because I felt strong. I opened it, because the sheer weight of the unanswered question had finally grown heavier than my dread. Ignorance was no longer a shield. It had become a blindfold, and I was standing on the edge of a cliff. Late on a Thursday evening, I drove back up to my laboratory at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. The facility sits perched near the edge of the Halemaumau crater. At night, the active lava lake casts a deep, pulsing red glow against the low-hanging clouds, bathing the viewing windows of my office in a crimson light. The air outside smelled of sulfur and sharp earth. The building was empty, save for a few night shift technicians in the lower basement. I needed the isolation. I needed a space dedicated to objective truth, where empirical data overruled human deception. I sat down at my steel desk, positioned the envelope under the harsh glare of my desk lamp, and took a steady breath. I slid a metal letter opener beneath the flap. The old dark wax cracked into brittle fragments, scattering across my desk like broken glass. I reached inside. I expected a long, emotional, handwritten confession pouring out apologies and regrets. Instead, I pulled out a stack of stiff clinical documents. The top page was a certified laboratory report bearing the letterhead of an independent genetic testing facility in Honolulu. Stapled to the front of this official document was a small square of plain stationery containing Aunt Rosa's neat, cramped handwriting. I read her note first. It bypassed sentiment and detailed the precise mechanics of what she had done. Uncle David did not die instantly on the water the day of his boating accident. He had been pulled from the ocean and kept alive on life support for 48 hours at the Hilo Medical Center before succumbing to his injuries. During that brief window, the hospital pathology department had taken tissue biopsies. They banked a tissue block preserving a surgical specimen of his cellular material in paraffin wax. It is standard procedure for fatal accident investigations. Rosa, as his legal wife and next of kin, retained full access to his medical archive. The note explained the second half of the equation. When I was 10 years old, I contracted a severe case of dengue fever that required a 4-day stay in a pediatric ward. Rosa had visited the hospital while Richard and Victoria remained at the coffee estate. Claiming she was updating family medical histories, she managed to obtain a routine blood card drawn during my admission. She had the biological materials. She possessed the preserved tissue of the golden son and the blood of the discarded affair child. Rosa privately commissioned the testing facility to extract the DNA from both samples and run a comparative kinship analysis. It was a real biological chain connecting two people the world believed had no ties. I set the handwritten note aside and looked at the certified lab report. My eyes scanned past the complex genetic markers, the allele frequencies, and the technical methodology, until I found the final conclusion printed at the bottom of the page in bold, unfeeling ink. The text stated that the probability of the tested male being the biological father of the tested female was 99.9%. I sat in the red glow of the active crater bleeding through my window and read that single line 3 times. The words rearranged the entire universe I had inhabited for 29 years. Richard was not my father. The shameful affair he had so bravely confessed to the world was a fabrication. The story of a generous man sheltering a helpless mistake was an elaborate theatrical production. I am David Gonzalez's biological daughter. Psychologists often talk about the stages of grief, but they rarely discuss the bizarre sequence of emotions that follow a paradigm-shifting revelation. The first wave that hit me was not a sense of triumph or even a surge of anger. It was a flash of absurd, disorienting relief. For my entire life, I had walked through the halls of the Kona estate, carrying a heavy, invisible cloak of shame. I believed I shared Richard's deceitful blood. I believed my very existence was a monument to infidelity and betrayal. Staring at the 99.9%, I felt that toxic inheritance evaporate. I was not made of his sins. I was free of his shadow. The sheer giddiness of that realization made me lightheaded. But that brief relief was immediately swallowed by a second, much colder wave. If Richard was not my father, then his entire narrative of charitable sacrifice collapsed. He did not take me in. He took me. He stole his dead brother's child. He stripped me of my true name, hid my parentage, and deliberately raised me as a scapegoat. He watched me endure decades of emotional starvation at the hands of a wife he intentionally manipulated. He constructed a prison of gratitude around me, forcing me to thank him for the privilege of being abused. It was not a passive lie. It was an active, sustained kidnapping of my identity. And then came the third layer, the bottom layer that truly chilled me. As the horror of his actions settled into my mind, a strange, calculating stillness took over my body. I looked down at my hands resting on the steel desk. They were not shaking. My pulse was not racing. I was not crying. Instead, my brain was already sorting the data, isolating the variables, and plotting a counteroffensive with predatory precision. A profound wave of nausea washed over me. I was appalled by my own coldness. I realized how much I resembled the very people I despised. The act of tearing down Richard's empire was going to require me to operate with the same tactical ruthlessness that he used to build it. I was becoming the monster in order to slay the monster. For the first time in my life, my own steady hands frightened me. The biological truth answered the question of who I was, but it opened a terrifying door to the question of motive. Why would a man go to such elaborate criminal lengths to erase his brother's child? There had to be a tangible, quantifiable reason to orchestrate a fraud of this magnitude. Emotional jealousy was not enough to sustain a 30-year lie. There was a financial engine driving this deception. To find the source of that engine, I had to stop looking at blood and start looking at paper. I needed to understand the rules of the game Richard was playing. I needed to read the original founding documents of the Gonzalez Trust. The answers were not in my laboratory. They were locked away in the county archives, waiting for someone to finally pull them out of the dark. I folded the DNA report, slipped it back into the envelope, and prepared to map the fault lines of my family's stolen wealth. I submitted a formal leave of absence the next morning, citing family issues, which was the most honest lie I have ever told. I traded the isolated red glow of the volcanic crater for the harsh fluorescent lights of the county records building in downtown Hilo. For 5 days, I became a ghost haunting the municipal archives. I sat in a windowless basement room surrounded by the smell of aged paper and the low mechanical hum of microfilm viewers. I needed to see the original architecture of the Gonzalez family wealth. I needed to find the exact financial blueprint that made my erasure necessary. My grandfather was a meticulous and commanding man who built the coffee empire from a few rugged acres into a sprawling, highly profitable estate. When I finally located the original founding trust documents drafted decades ago, the legal language was dense, but its intent was unmistakable. The trust dictated that the estate and all its associated landholdings would pass strictly and entirely to the firstborn biological child of his eldest son, David. There was a secondary contingency clause written near the bottom of the page. If David died childless, the entire estate would default to the second son, Richard. That single word jumped off the yellowed page and locked around my throat. Childless. I was David's biological child. The entire legal transfer of the $40 million property hinged entirely on erasing my existence from the family tree. Richard did not hate me because I was an inconvenience or a reminder of a youthful mistake. He hated me because I was the rightful owner of the ground he walked on. My presence was a ticking time bomb threatening his inheritance. I kept digging through the microfilm, scanning through years of public filings. I searched for the birth certificates and the legal petitions from the year I was born. After hours of scrolling, I found a paternity affidavit bearing Richard's signature. It was filed exactly 3 weeks after David drowned in the ocean. 3 weeks after his older brother took his last breath, Richard legally cemented me as his own illegitimate affair baby. He filed the paperwork quietly, bypassing any need for a formal adoption hearing or a public inquiry. He brought me into his pristine home and handed Victoria a fabricated betrayal. He convinced his own wife that I was the living, breathing proof of his infidelity, knowing her pride would never allow her to treat me with an ounce of kindness. He guaranteed I would grow up isolated, detested, and completely unaware of my true lineage. By framing me as his shameful mistake, he ensured no one would ever look too closely at my origins. It was a cold, calculated machine designed to funnel a fortune into his own pockets while forcing me to pay the emotional toll for a sin he invented. Sitting at the microfilm viewer, I felt a sharp surge of adrenaline. I had the motive, and I had the biological proof from Rosa's envelope. But my analytical training quickly poured cold water over my rising confidence. I pulled a photocopy of Rosa's genetic lab report from my leather bag and studied the details again. My scientific background forced me to look at the document not as a victim seeking justice, but as an adversary looking for weaknesses. The fatal flaw was glaring. It was a private commission. Rosa had collected the blood card from my hospital stay and the tissue sample from the pathology lab herself, outside of any official legal or medical oversight. There was no notarized chain of custody. There were no sworn affidavits from the nurses or the pathology technicians confirming how the materials were handled, transported, or stored. In the scientific community, the data was undeniable. The numbers matched. But in a courtroom setting, the report was virtually useless. Any competent defense attorney would take one look at that 11-year-old envelope and tear it to shreds. They would claim it was a total fabrication manufactured by a bitter, unstable daughter trying to extort her generous father. They would argue the samples were tainted or forged or stolen. They would paint me as a greedy opportunist attacking a respected community figure. The report was a powerful lead, but it was not admissible proof. I felt the false victory curdle in my stomach, leaving a sour, metallic taste in my mouth. I had the truth, but I lacked the legally binding weapon required to execute a strike. If I walked into his birthday luau and slammed that envelope on the table, Richard would simply call his lawyers, discredit me in front of the developers, and have me escorted off the property. He would win again. The stakes had just multiplied. I needed undeniable, ironclad documentation to anchor the science. I packed the copies into my bag and walked out of the records building. The humid afternoon heat hit my skin, but I felt entirely cold. I sat in my car in the parking lot and let my mind drift back to the central mystery that still made no sense. If the DNA report was just a lead I needed to understand the exact mechanics of my birth. My thoughts returned to Aunt Rosa. The puzzle pieces from my childhood were rattling around in my brain, refusing to fit together. If I was David's biological child, who was my mother. The official family story claimed my mother was an unnamed woman who disappeared shortly after my birth. But Rosa was David's legal wife at the time. I pulled up the digitized public marriage and census records on my laptop right there in the driver's seat. According to the state of Hawaii, David and Rosa Gonzalez officially had no children. They were documented as a childless couple right up until the day David died. But the paper trail clashed violently with my actual lived experience. I thought about Rosa laying in that narrow hospice bed, apologizing for her cowardice. A woman apologizing for cowardice is a woman who failed to protect someone she was morally obligated to protect. I thought about the visceral, involuntary flinch she exhibited every time Victoria shot me a cruel look across the dinner table. It was not disgust. It was the physical reaction of someone watching a tragedy they felt powerless to stop. Then I looked down at my hands resting on the steering wheel. I stared at my crooked left thumb. Richard had casually dismissed it years ago, saying I inherited it from my mother's side. He meant the phantom mistress. But traits are inherited from real biological sources. I pictured Rosa pouring tea at a family gathering, holding the saucer with her left hand. I tried to visualize the shape of her fingers. A terrifying suspicion began to form in my chest. It was a hypothesis so disturbing I could barely hold it in my mind. There was only one way to confirm it. I opened my web browser and navigated to the State Health Department portal. I clicked through to the medical records request forms. As a direct relative, I was permitted to request certain archival documents under specific legal guidelines. I found the section for Rosa Gonzalez. I began to type in the details required to pull Rosa's personal medical history from the year of my birth. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. My hands were not steady when I filled out the digital form. I told myself I already knew everything the paper could say. I assumed I had uncovered the bottom of the deception and mapped the boundaries of Richard's greed. I was wrong about that, the way I had been wrong about a great many things I thought I had clearly mapped. Geologists chart fault lines to know exactly where the ground will fail. I was about to learn my own map was dangerously incomplete. The days following my submission to the State Health Department were a masterclass in holding my breath. I returned to my laboratory on the slopes of the volcano, throwing myself into my work to keep my mind from spiraling. I analyzed gas emissions and plotted tectonic stress charts, but my eyes kept drifting to the incoming mail tray. I was waiting for the medical records that would either confirm my darkest hypothesis or send me back to the drawing board. My lab was my sanctuary. It smelled of ozone and dark roasted coffee. It was a place where variables could be controlled, and data never lied. The humming servers and glowing monitors provided a predictable rhythm that stood in stark contrast to the volatile, shifting ground of my family history. That sanctuary was breached exactly 2 weeks before Richard's birthday luau. I was calibrating a ground deformation sensor when the heavy steel doors of the corridor swung open. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels echoed against the polished concrete floor. That sound did not belong in a research facility. I turned away from my monitors and saw Victoria and Sarah walking into my workspace. They looked like they had stepped directly out of a luxury resort catalog. Victoria wore a crisp linen sundress, and her hair was pulled back into an immaculate twist that defied the island humidity. Sarah followed close behind her eyes, scanning the metal tables and rock samples with undisguised contempt. She carefully sidestepped a box of volcanic ash, as if proximity alone might contaminate her expensive leather shoes. They had driven all the way from the Kona coast unannounced to deliver a message in person. I wiped my hands on a shop towel and stood my ground. Victoria did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was doing. She walked directly up to my workstation and placed a pristine white envelope on the steel surface. She smoothed the paper with her manicured fingers and offered me a smile dripping with false aloha. "Your father's birthday is going to be heavily covered by the local press, Elizabeth," she said, her voice pitched in a sweet, reasonable register. "The executives from Pacific Horizon will be in attendance along with the mayor and several key investors from the mainland. We think it is best if you sit this one out." She paused, letting her eyes drift over my simple work clothes. "It is a very high-profile family celebration, and we do not need your complicated history making the buyers uncomfortable." Sarah stepped up beside our mother, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked at the white envelope and then at me. "Consider it a severance," she added, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "A little gift to help you with your rocks. Just cash it and stay in Hilo." The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the air between us. This was the moment they needed me gone. The luau was not just a birthday party. It was the grand stage where Richard planned to publicly announce the signed deal to the developers and the press. He was going to cement the $40 million sale under the guise of an island celebration. They needed the family narrative to look flawless. They needed the illusion of the perfect, unbroken Gonzalez dynasty. My presence, the living reminder of an alleged affair, would introduce an unsavory element to their pristine corporate presentation. Every instinct in my body screamed to fight back. I wanted to slide that envelope right back across the table. I wanted to look them in the eye and tell them I knew the truth about David and the forged paternity affidavit. I wanted to watch their arrogant smiles melt into panic. But years of surviving their household had taught me the value of tactical restraint. If I showed my hand now, if I reacted with cold defiance, Victoria would immediately sense a shift in my behavior. Her radar for insubordination was flawless. If she suspected I was plotting against them, she would warn Richard. He would accelerate the closing deploy his corporate attorneys and bury me before I ever got the chance to strike. Pride in this moment would cost me the war. I took a slow breath and forced my shoulders to round forward. I needed to execute a decoy. I had to give them exactly the version of the broken, obedient daughter they expected to see. I let my jaw tremble. I focused on the harsh fluorescent lights above until a manufactured stinging sensation brought moisture to my eyes. I looked down at the white envelope and let my voice waver just enough to sound defeated. "That is actually really kind," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on the table. "Thank you. I know I do not fit in at those things anyway." The tension in Victoria's shoulders vanished instantly. Her predatory radar went dark. She exchanged a swift, triumphant glance with Sarah. They had won. They had successfully purchased my absence and neutralized their only vulnerability. Victoria offered a soft, patronizing sigh. "It is for the best, Elizabeth," she said. "We will send you some photographs." They turned on their heels and walked out of the laboratory, leaving the heavy envelope sitting on my desk. I waited until the steel doors clicked shut and their footsteps faded down the corridor. My tears evaporated immediately. I picked up the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a cashier's check made out to me for $5,000. The following morning, I drove to the local bank branch in downtown Hilo. I walked up to the teller, handed over the check, and deposited the funds directly into my primary account. I then crossed the street to a small stationery shop and purchased a thick, cream-colored card. I sat at a quiet corner table in a nearby coffee shop and uncapped my pen. I had to complete the illusion. I wrote a short, gracious note in the neat, submissive handwriting they were accustomed to seeing from me. "Thank you for thinking of me," I wrote. "I will be at the observatory that night. Please give Dad my love." I sealed the note, stamped it, and dropped it into a blue postal box on the corner. The strategic success of the decoy was undeniable. Sarah would show the note to the family, proving I had finally learned my place. They would relax their defenses entirely. But internally, the performance exacted a heavy toll. Cashing that check and sending that subservient letter felt like putting on the clothes of a corpse. It felt like stepping back into a skin I had just managed to shed. I had to force myself to embody the weak, invisible girl who was grateful for the scraps falling from their table. I played the broken daughter for one last performance, and the psychological revulsion was profound. Sitting in my car outside the post office, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The nausea churning in my stomach was not a sign of weakness. It was the physical rejection of the lie I had lived for 29 years. I realized in that moment exactly who I would never be again. I would never again shrink to accommodate their comfort. I would never again accept a price tag placed on my dignity. The $5,000 they meant as an insult was actually the final tool I needed to destroy them. The money provided the exact financial cushion required to secure top-tier legal representation. I needed an attorney who operated with the same cold precision I applied to tectonic data. I needed someone who could weaponize the medical records I was still waiting for. The postal box on the corner held my final act of submission. The bank account now held their involuntary contribution to my war chest. I put the car in gear and headed back to the laboratory. The decoy was planted, and the enemy was complacent. Now I just needed the state health department to deliver the final piece of the puzzle so I could hire the man who would help me drop the sky on their heads. I booked an early morning flight from Hilo to Honolulu the day after cashing their check. The $5,000 they gave me to buy my silence paid for my plane ticket and the retainer fee for the most ruthless estate litigator on the island. His name was Thomas. He operated out of a sleek glass high-rise overlooking the harbor where the ocean met the concrete city. He did not build his reputation on gentle mediations or quiet settlements. He built his career by dismantling complex trusts and exposing corporate fraud. I walked into his office, laid my leather folio on his heavy oak desk, and took a seat in a stiff leather chair. I did not waste his time with emotional backstory. I handed him the original trust document my grandfather drafted, the forged paternity affidavit Richard filed, and the genetic lab report Aunt Rosa had left me in the wax-sealed envelope. I watched his eyes scan the papers, waiting for the professional verdict that would dictate my next move. Thomas adjusted his glasses and read the paperwork. The silence in his office stretched for 20 minutes. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the turning of crisp pages. When he finally finished, he set the documents down and removed his glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and looked at me with cold, professional clarity. "This is multi-million-dollar theft," he said, his voice steady and serious. "Your father is attempting to sell a title he does not legally own. But there is a serious problem." He tapped his silver pen against the genetic report. "This DNA analysis is inadmissible as it stands. There is no chain of custody. Rosa collected these samples privately without a neutral medical witness. If we present this to a judge, his attorneys will shred it. They will claim you forged the results. This report is a lead, but it is not proof. We need a fresh court-ordered kinship test to verify the biological link, and we need a judge to interpret the trust before the closing goes through. It will be tight. We are racing a ticking clock." I felt a heavy knot form in my chest. The path forward required time, and time was the one resource I lacked. Before I could respond, the receptionist knocked on the heavy wooden door. She carried a thick manila envelope delivered by a priority courier. I had arranged for my state health department request to be forwarded directly to this office to avoid any interception at my home address. Thomas handed the package across the desk. "These are Rosa's archived medical records," I explained. "I requested them to look for any discrepancies regarding her timeline with my Uncle David. I broke the seal and pulled out the stack of printed medical charts. I scanned the pages of her clinical history. I read past routine checkups and minor illnesses. I flipped through pages of standard laboratory results. Then I found the obstetrics and gynecology section from 29 years ago. My eyes locked onto a delivery room summary printed on faded hospital letterhead. The date of admission was exactly 3 weeks before the day my Uncle David drowned in the ocean. The records documented a healthy full-term delivery following 12 hours of labor. The patient was Rosa Gonzalez. The child was female. The birth weight and time were recorded with clinical precision. I stopped breathing. The clinical text blurred in front of my eyes as my brain tried to process the impossible data. Rosa was not my aunt. She was my mother. David and Rosa had me. They were a family for 3 short weeks before the ocean took my father away from us. I handed the paper to Thomas across the desk, my hand trembling for the first time that day. He read the delivery summary, and his professional demeanor cracked. He let out a long, slow breath and leaned back in his chair, staring at the document. "This is not just fraud," he whispered. "This is a stolen child." The horrifying mechanics of the scheme finally snapped into sharp focus, illuminating the darkest corners of my childhood. When David died, the estate was legally destined to pass to his newborn biological heir. That meant the entire Kona coffee empire belonged to me. Richard was the executor of the family trust and the controller of the finances. He approached a devastated, grieving widow holding a 3-week-old infant, and he lied to her. He must have told Rosa that if the world learned David had a living heir, a protracted legal battle would drain the estate and leave them bankrupt. He convinced her that the only way to save the family was to let him quietly manage things. He filed the forged paternity affidavit, claiming me as his own affair child. He used guilt, threat, and grief to separate a mother from her own baby under the same roof. He raised me as his shameful secret to ensure I would never know my true worth and to ensure no one would ever question his right to the land. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Rosa flinching every time I walked into a room was not disgust. It was a mother watching her stolen daughter being treated like dirt across a dining table and staying silent out of pure terror. She lived as a ghost on the edges of our family gatherings, forced to watch Victoria punish me for a sin that never happened. I remembered all the time she looked away when I tried to catch her eye. The deathbed envelope was not just an apology from a coward. It was a mother's final, desperate confession. The woman I had read as cold had loved me from across a room for my entire life and had been too broken by my uncle's death and Richard's manipulation to save me. I had spent my career studying the earth, searching for hidden fractures and warning signs, but I had misread the most important seismograph of my life. I did not scream. I did not fly into a rage or demand immediate vengeance. I sat in the leather chair and felt the entire floor of my identity drop away into a bottomless abyss. A grief so profound washed over me that it circled back into a strange, frozen calm. The false narrative I had survived was finally dead. Every piece of data was now aligned. I looked up at Thomas and nodded. The engine of my retribution was fully armed. We had to move fast to lock down the estate before the birthday luau. The timeline was narrow and the legal hurdles were immense, but I knew exactly what needed to be done next. The time for silent observation was over. Thomas moved with the swift clinical efficiency of a surgeon preparing an operating room. The evidence was irrefutable, but securing the perimeter required a massive, coordinated legal strike. He drafted an emergency petition demanding a court-ordered kinship test. He filed a motion compelling the pathology laboratory at the Hilo Medical Center to release the preserved tissue block from David's accident under a strict supervised chain of custody. He coordinated with an independent certified lab in Honolulu to draw my blood and run the comparative analysis on an expedited timeline. The science was the foundation of our entire case, but the science took time. While the biological evidence was processing, Thomas simultaneously launched a devastating financial attack on the Kona Coffee estate. He filed a quiet title action challenging Richard's legal ownership of the land based on the newly discovered medical records and the fraudulent paternity affidavit. To ensure Richard could not finalize the $40 million sale to Pacific Horizon, Thomas recorded a lis pendens against the property. The filing served as a public notice of pending litigation, effectively warning any potential buyer that the title was contested. This legal maneuvering introduced a terrifying element of genuine jeopardy to the plan. A lis pendens is a public record. The corporate attorneys representing the mainland developers at Pacific Horizon were highly diligent professionals. They ran continuous automated title searches on the property to protect their massive investment. If their automated systems caught our filing before the birthday luau, the entire trap would collapse. The developers would immediately halt the closing process and postpone the deal indefinitely. This delay would provide Richard with ample time to assemble his own team of expensive corporate litigators. He would have the resources and the connections to publicly discredit me, branding me as a delusional, unstable woman, desperate for money. Even worse, a delay would give him the opportunity to locate and destroy David's preserved tissue sample before the court-mandated test could be completed. He had already proven he was willing to forge documents and steal a child. Sabotaging a medical archive would barely register on his moral compass. Timing was the critical factor that would dictate success or total ruin. Thomas engineered a strategy to manipulate the county filing system. He prepared the quiet title action and the lis pendens, but he deliberately held the paperwork until the very last possible moment. He submitted the documents to the county clerk at 4:59 on Friday afternoon, exactly 1 minute before the municipal offices closed for the weekend. By timing the submission so late, the filing was officially stamped and entered into the court record, establishing my legal claim to the property. However, the administrative delay meant the electronic notice would not propagate through the digital title search databases until the following Monday morning. The developers' automated systems would remain blind over the weekend. The birthday luau was scheduled for Saturday night. We had successfully engineered a 72-hour window of perfect silence. We had locked down the property and blinded the enemy simultaneously. But there was a significant flaw in our preparation. The expedited court-ordered genetic test was the ultimate wild card. The certified laboratory in Honolulu promised to rush the analysis, but they could not guarantee the final report would be completed and delivered before the luau on Saturday evening. Complex genetic sequencing requires meticulous processing, and the laboratory refused to compromise their standards for our convenience. This meant I faced the terrifying prospect of walking into that crowded celebration armed with a powerful injunction, but lacking the singular, undeniable piece of evidence required to make my claim bulletproof. I had Rosa's old unverified report and her medical records, but without the fresh court-mandated DNA results, I might be forced to bluff my way through a confrontation with my father and his aggressive legal team. The anxiety of that uncertainty gnawed at my composure. The night before the luau, I sat alone in my small house, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The weight of what I was about to do pressed down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. The old lie I had lived by staged its final, desperate defense. The conditioning of my childhood screamed at me to retreat, to make myself small, to avoid causing a disturbance. I was not afraid of Richard or Victoria or Sarah. I was afraid of myself. I was terrified of becoming the kind of person who detonates the lives of 80 guests, ruins a massive corporate deal, and shatters a family narrative in the middle of a catered party. The instinct to keep the peace was a powerful narcotic. I opened my messaging app and drafted a text to Thomas. "Let us just settle quietly," I typed. "We can show them the medical records and negotiate a private buyout." I stared at the words on the screen, my thumb hovering over the send button. The safety of a quiet resolution was incredibly tempting. Then I looked across the room at the small fireproof safe sitting open in my closet. I picked up the handwritten note Aunt Rosa had left for me in the heavy envelope. "I owe you a truth I was too much of a coward to give you, while it could still help," she had written. I traced the faded ink of her cursive script. I thought about a young mother terrified and alone giving up her newborn child because a powerful man convinced her that silence was the only way to save the family. I realized that the word quiet was the exact mechanism that allowed a mother to lose her daughter. It was the tool Richard used to isolate me, and it was the weapon Victoria used to punish me. Silence had never kept the peace in the Gonzalez household. Silence had merely funded their luxurious comfort, using my dignity and Rosa's heartbreak as the currency. Staying quiet was not an act of nobility, it was an act of complicity. I deleted the drafted text message. I closed my phone and set it on the nightstand. I sat in the darkness and made a vow to the mother I never knew. I refused to let her cowardice become my legacy. If you have ever mistaken your own silence for peace, trying to keep a toxic system stable at your own expense, you already know exactly what I decided to do next. I packed my leather folio with the documents I had available. I laid out a simple black dress for the following evening. I prepared myself to walk into the center of their perfect celebration. The trap was set and the timer was ticking down. The only question remaining was whether the final piece of evidence would arrive before I had to strike the match. Saturday morning broke with a heavy, oppressive humidity that felt like a physical weight pressing against the windows of my house. The sky over the volcano was a bruised purple, bruised and thick with impending rain. It was the day of the luau, and the meticulously engineered plan Thomas and I had built began to unravel before I even finished my morning coffee. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, vibrating with a sharp, urgent energy. It was a text from the genetic laboratory in Honolulu. The message was brief and devastatingly professional. They had hit a sudden backlog in their sequencing equipment. The expedited court-ordered DNA results were delayed. They could not guarantee delivery before the end of the business day. The primary weapon in my arsenal, the undeniable biological proof that would shatter Richard's carefully constructed narrative, was suddenly unavailable. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold sweat prickle along my hairline. Before I could process the implications of the delay, the phone rang in my hand. It was Thomas, and his voice lacked its usual calm, measured cadence. He sounded tense and clipped. "Elizabeth, we have a massive problem," he said, skipping any pleasantries. The timing strategy failed. Someone tipped off the corporate counsel representing Pacific Horizon. They ran an off-cycle manual title search early this morning and caught the list pendants filing. The developers know the title is clouded, and more importantly, Richard knows. I leaned heavily against the kitchen counter, gripping the edge of the granite to steady myself. The 72-hour window of perfect silence we had relied upon had shattered. "How bad is it?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and unfamiliar to my own ears. "It is a worst-case scenario," Thomas replied bluntly. "Richard has had his legal team working since dawn. They are drafting motions to dissolve the injunction, claiming the filing is a malicious fabrication. They are attempting to frame this as an extortion attempt by an estranged family member. But that is not the worst part. My contacts just informed me that Richard contacted the estate manager early this morning. He ordered a complete clean-out of the family's private medical archive. He instructed them to destroy all old pathology records related to David's accident. He is trying to sever the sample chain before the court test can be finalized. He is attempting to erase the biological evidence. The line went dead, leaving me standing in the silent kitchen with the realization that my entire offensive had crumbled. Richard was not just reacting to my legal strike. He was actively destroying the foundation of my claim. He was using his wealth, his connections, and his sheer ruthlessness to outmaneuver me. He was one step ahead, and he was closing the net rapidly. I gathered my leather folio containing the inadmissible genetic report and the court injunction and walked out to my car. I drove down the mountain toward the Kona coast, the familiar scenic route feeling like a march toward an execution. I parked my vehicle on a gravel shoulder a half-mile away from the sprawling Gonzalez estate. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the distant line of palm trees swaying in the tropical breeze. For the first time since opening Rosa's envelope, my hands began to tremble violently. I did not try to stop them. I did not pretend to be strong. I gripped the steering wheel and let the physical reality of my impending failure wash over me. This was the absolute lowest point. It was a dark, hollow space where optimism died, and the brutal mechanics of power dictated the outcome. I had sacrificed the safety of my lifelong invisibility. I had traded the quiet, miserable comfort of being the ignored scapegoat for the terrifying exposure of a public rebellion. And now I was facing the very real possibility that I would lose everything. I would be dragged into a courtroom stripped of my evidence and publicly humiliated. Richard's expensive lawyers would paint me as a delusional, greedy pariah. The island society would rally behind the benevolent patriarch, and I would be permanently branded as the unstable problem child they had always claimed I was. My mother was dead. My biological proof was delayed. The medical archives were being destroyed. The entire structure I had built to reclaim my identity was collapsing. The old psychological lie I had been conditioned to believe rose up and whispered its final seductive argument. It told me that this was the inevitable consequence of stepping out of line. It reminded me that I was a mistake, who should have remained grateful for the scraps I was given. It sneered at my arrogance for believing I could challenge the established order of the Gonzalez family. See it whispered in the quiet interior of my car. You should have stayed small. You should have taken the $5,000 and hidden in your laboratory. You brought this ruin upon yourself. I closed my eyes and let the despair settle heavy and thick in my chest. The fight seemed entirely pointless. I reached for the ignition key, ready to turn the car around and drive back up the mountain. I was ready to surrender. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. A single text message illuminated the screen. It was from Thomas. I picked up the device, expecting instructions on how to withdraw the quiet title action and minimize the legal fallout. Instead, I read a sequence of sentences that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the day. The pathology lab, Thomas wrote. The external commercial facility at the Hilo Medical Center, not the private family archive Richard raided. They still hold the original preserved tissue block in their secure vault. Richard does not have the legal authority to order its destruction. He could only touch the private estate records. The commercial sample is secure and under court protection. The genetic test is proceeding. The lab just confirmed they are rushing the final report via a dedicated courier. It will arrive during the luau tonight. I read the text twice, my trembling hands suddenly going perfectly still. The biological evidence was safe. Richard had destroyed his own copies, but the primary source material remained untouchable. The science was holding the line. Then a second message from Thomas arrived, delivering a devastating secondary payload. "There is a second card to play," he wrote. "My paralegals just finished sorting through the personal effects Rosa left with the initial genetic report. Buried among her financial papers is a contemporaneous notarized letter. She wrote it and had it legally witnessed and sealed the very year you were born. The letter explicitly names you as her biological daughter. It details Richard's coercion, the threats he made against her, and the mechanics of the forged paternity affidavit. The document is dated, witnessed by independent third parties, and entirely independent of the genetic testing. It is fully admissible in a court of law. It is devastating." I sat in my car staring at the screen. The heavy, oppressive despair evaporated instantly, replaced by a sharp, crystalline clarity. The ground beneath the Kona estate was indeed hollow, but the structural failure was not threatening my foundation. The void was opening directly beneath Richard, Victoria, and Sarah. Their desperate attempts to destroy evidence and manipulate the narrative were the panicked actions of people who realized their foundation was crumbling. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had secured their empire. They did not realize that the very documents they tried to burn were backed by a dead woman's meticulous, legally binding confession. I placed my phone back in the cup holder and turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life. I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the highway, heading straight toward the torchlight. The evening of the birthday luau was a study in manufactured perfection. I parked my car near the service entrance, avoiding the valet line, and walked onto the sprawling grounds of the Gonzales Kona estate. The scene was laid out like a glossy travel brochure advertising a luxury resort experience. Dozens of tall tiki torches cast a warm, flickering light across the immaculate manicured lawns. The ocean breeze carried the scent of roasting pork and plumeria blossoms. 80 guests mingled near the shoreline, including the wealthy island elite local politicians and the sharp-suited executives from Pacific Horizon. A troupe of traditional hula dancers performed on a raised wooden platform, moving gracefully to tell the sacred stories of the islands. It was a beautiful display of culture utterly corrupted by its use as a cheap theatrical backdrop for a corporate sellout. I arrived wearing a simple, unadorned black dress, carrying only my leather folio containing the injunction and Rosa's notarized letter. I bypassed the greeting line and slipped into the crowd. Because my decoy had been executed perfectly earlier in the week, my sudden appearance sent a visible shockwave through the host family. Sarah was working the room, pouring expensive champagne for the developers and laughing her glittering, hollow laugh. She spotted me first. Her smile froze, and her hand tightened around the neck of the bottle, but she quickly masked her reaction, turning back to her conversation. Victoria was performing her role as the gracious hostess, directing caterers with subtle hand gestures. When her eyes locked onto mine, the serene facade slipped. She glared at me, her posture rigid with suppressed fury. But she was trapped by the social constraints of her own party. She could not cause a scene in front of the press or the mainland investors. Richard was holding court near the central roasting pit, accepting congratulations and posing for photographs. I watched his face as he registered my presence in the crowd. The tight camera-ready smile faltered for a fraction of a second, exposing the raw anxiety churning beneath his confident exterior. But he recovered instantly, seamlessly, reverting to the benevolent patriarch character he had perfected over 3 decades. He assumed I had come to grovel. He likely believed the $5,000 check had failed to satisfy my financial demands, and I was there to beg for a larger settlement. Or perhaps he was already too deeply entrenched in damage control with his legal team to risk moving against me publicly at his own celebration in front of the media. His hesitation was the structural weakness I needed. I stayed near the periphery of the event, sipping sparkling water and observing the dynamics of the room. I noticed details the other guests remained entirely oblivious to. Richard was not fully present in the celebration. He kept pulling his phone from his pocket, checking the screen with a subtle, frantic urgency. More tellingly, I spotted a man in a dark suit standing just beyond the perimeter of the torchlight, hovering near the tree line. It was one of his corporate attorneys, constantly monitoring the situation and communicating with Richard via short, silent nods. Richard knew the court-ordered injunction existed. He knew the Ellis pendants was currently clouding the title. He was betting everything on his ability to finalize the $40 million transaction tonight, relying on his influence and his legal team to discredit my claim on Monday morning before the developers discovered the truth. He was playing a high-stakes game of bluff, and he was terrified. At 8 o'clock sharp, the soft rhythmic strumming of the ukulele music faded into the background. The low hum of conversation subsided as Richard tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The clear, ringing sound commanded the attention of the 80 guests. He stood at the head table, the ocean spreading out behind him in the dark, and launched into a grand, sweeping speech. He spoke eloquently about the history of the Gonzalez estate, weaving a narrative of hard work, sacrifice, and the enduring power of the Aloha spirit. He masterfully transitioned into the business at hand, officially welcoming the executives from Pacific Horizon. He announced the $40 million partnership, claiming the resort development would bring the ancestral estate into the modern era while preserving its heritage. The mainland developers beamed, raising their glasses in a toast to their lucrative new venture. Then Richard did exactly what I knew he would do. Feeling subtly rattled by the legal threats closing in around him, and unnerved by my silent presence in the crowd, he reached for his oldest, most reliable script. He sought comfort in the narrative that had sustained his power for 29 years. He needed to assert his dominance and remind everyone of his supposed moral superiority. He gestured toward the back of the lawn where I was standing in the shadows. He used me as a prop one last time, and to Elizabeth he set his voice echoing over the sound system with a perfectly calibrated tone of sorrowful affection. My problem, child. Proof that even our greatest mistakes can be taught the meaning of Ohana. The executives from Pacific Horizon nodded approvingly, exchanging impressed glances. In their eyes, Richard was demonstrating remarkable grace. They saw a good, generous man who was willing to publicly shoulder his burdens and care for the unfortunate results of a past indiscretion. The crowd offered a polite, murmuring chuckle, signaling their alignment with the patriarch. The collective pity of 80 people washed over the lawn, settling heavily in my direction. For my entire life, I had responded to that exact sentence by lowering my eyes, staring at the ground and absorbing the public shame to protect his ego. I had accepted the role of the damaged mistake because I believed it was the only way to retain my fragile place in the family structure. But tonight, standing in the warm tropical air, holding a leather folio filled with devastating truth, the shame did not stick. The heavy, oppressive weight of their pity simply slid off my shoulders. The emotional response that bloomed in my chest was entirely unexpected. It was not a sudden, violent surge of rage. I did not feel an overwhelming sense of triumphant vindication. Instead, a strange, quiet tenderness washed over me. I felt a profound sense of compassion for the 18-year-old girl who had stood by a hospice bed and for the child who had hidden in a closet, believing she deserved to be treated like a stain. I mourned the decades I had spent trying to earn the love of a man who had stolen my identity. The lie that my worth depended on their validation finally crumbled into dust. I set my glass of sparkling water down on a passing waiter's tray. The waiter paused, but I was already moving forward. I did not storm the stage. I did not raise my voice or create a frantic spectacle. I walked smoothly and deliberately out of the shadows and into the bright circle of torchlight. I crossed the manicured grass toward the head table, holding the leather folio at my side. As I closed the distance, the ground beneath the Kona estate began to move. I walked toward the head table with steady, measured steps. The thick, manicured grass muffled my approach, allowing me to reach the center of the gathering before anyone could intercept me. I stopped inches from where Richard stood. The heat from the roasting pit radiated against my back, but my focus remained locked on the man standing on the elevated platform. I placed my leather folio onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. I reached inside and extracted the frayed, aged paper holding Rosa's legacy. I set it directly on top of his printed speech notes. I used 2 fingers to square the edge against the corner of his podium. "Since we are discussing your greatest mistakes, Richard," I said, my voice crisp and level. The microphone mounted on the podium caught my words and broadcast them across the sweeping lawn. "I think the buyers should see the true foundation this estate is built upon." The crowd went entirely still. The ambient chatter ceased instantly. The only sounds remaining were the crackle of the tiki torches and the distant rhythmic crash of the Pacific waves against the volcanic rock. I pulled the faded genetic laboratory report from the old casing. I held the document up high so the Pacific Horizon executives, seated at the front tables, could clearly see the official letterhead. I read the text aloud, ensuring every syllable carried the weight of the undeniable truth. Certified analysis, comparing my blood to the preserved tissue of David Gonzalez. Probability of paternity is 99.9%. Richard is not my father. I lowered the paper and braced myself for his collapse. I expected the arrogant facade to shatter. I expected him to pale, to stammer, to search for an excuse. But Richard did not crumble. He proved exactly why he had successfully maintained a stolen empire for 3 decades. He executed a flawless countermeasure. He laughed. It was a warm, sorrowful, deeply practiced sound. It was the heavy sigh of a burdened man forced to endure a tragedy in public. He shook his head slowly, looking down at his hands, before turning his attention away from me and directly toward the developers. "Friends, I am so sorry you are seeing this," he said, his tone dripping with paternal grief. He placed a hand over his heart, painting the very picture of a wounded but endlessly patient father. "My daughter has struggled with deep emotional instability for many years. We have tried everything to help her. This so-called report is an unnotarized document she assembled herself in her laboratory. There is 0 chain of custody. There is no legal standing. It is nothing more than the sad fantasy of a troubled woman who has never accepted her place in our family." He gestured toward the edge of the tree line. The man in the dark suit stepped forward into the light. It was his corporate attorney projecting an aura of quiet authority. The lawyer caught the eyes of the lead developer and nodded gravely, confirming the legal inadmissibility of the paper I held in my hand. He silently verified every lie Richard had just spoken. The tactical brilliance of the maneuver was breathtaking. Richard did not argue the science. He attacked the source. He weaponized the very vulnerability he had spent my entire life cultivating. By branding me as unstable, he rendered my evidence irrelevant. I watched the devastating effect ripple through the audience. The faces of the Pacific Horizon executives shifted in real time. The initial shock morphed into professional skepticism. Then their expressions softened into genuine sympathy, aimed squarely at Richard. They looked at him with renewed respect for enduring such a difficult family situation. They looked at me with polite disdain, treating me like a broken mechanism that was interrupting their lucrative evening. The shift in the room was palpable. The collective sympathy of 80 people swung back to the patriarch, anchoring his authority stronger than before. Sarah stood near the champagne fountain and offered a smug, triumphant smirk. She took a slow sip from her crystal flute, reveling in my public defeat. Victoria let out a long, visible breath, relaxing her posture. The crisis was averted, the narrative held, the illusion remained intact. I stood there holding the piece of paper that suddenly felt like worthless trash. The truth was slipping through my fingers, crushed under the sheer momentum of his 30-year deception. For a long, terrible beat, I was exactly the unstable problem child he had manufactured. The psychological conditioning of my youth surged back up from the dark corners of my mind. It was a suffocating physical weight pressing against my chest. The old lie whispered in my ear. It told me he was right. It told me I was the problem. It urged me to sit down, to apologize, to retreat into the shadows where I belonged. I felt the ground beneath me turn to ash. I had sacrificed my quiet life to bring the truth into the light, and the light had simply rejected it. The story Richard built was beating the truth in real time, and I had no secondary weapon to deploy. The biological evidence was delayed. The medical archives were likely already burning. I was standing on a stage with a prop sword, facing a man with an army. The lead developer cleared his throat and adjusted his suit jacket, preparing to offer Richard a comforting word and move the evening past the awkward interruption. The window was closing. The victory was slipping away. Then a sudden sharp sound cut through the heavy tropical air. It was the distinct crunch of heavy tires rolling rapidly over the crushed gravel of the main driveway. The sound was out of place. The valet service had parked all the guest vehicles on the lower lawn hours ago. The driveway was supposed to be clear. Headlights swept across the manicured grass, cutting a bright, harsh arc through the soft torchlight. A white delivery van braked abruptly near the edge of the patio. The door opened and a courier stepped out into the humid night. He wore a standard uniform and carried a thick, rigid cardboard parcel bearing the official seal of the county courthouse. He looked around the silent, staring crowd, unfazed by the tension in the atmosphere. He consulted a digital clipboard in his hand. "I have a priority legal delivery," he announced, his voice cutting through the quiet. "I am looking for an Elizabeth Gonzalez." The smug smirk vanished from Sarah's face. Victoria stiffened, gripping the edge of a nearby chair. I shifted my gaze back to Richard. The warm, sorrowful mask was gone. His practiced smile froze into a rigid, terrified grimace. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He stared at the courier with wide, unblinking eyes, recognizing the arrival of the one variable he could not control. He knew exactly what kind of documents arrived in rigid courthouse parcels on a Saturday night. The off-cycle title search had warned him about the injunction, but he had bet everything on the genetic sequence remaining unfinished. The delay at the Honolulu facility had ended. The science had finally caught up to the fraud. I turned away from the man who had stolen my life. I walked across the grass toward the courier, leaving the head table behind. I reached out and held my hand steady in the bright beam of the headlights. "I am Elizabeth Gonzalez," I said. "I will sign for that." I signed the electronic keypad with a firm, deliberate stroke. The courier handed over the thick, rigid parcel, nodded briefly, and climbed back into his delivery van. The tires crunched over the gravel as he reversed down the driveway, disappearing into the tropical darkness. The fading glow of the taillights left the lawn bathed once again in the flickering amber light of the tiki torches. The 80 guests remained entirely silent, watching me return to the center of the gathering. The atmosphere had shifted. The polite sympathy they had offered Richard just moments ago was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory curiosity. They smelled blood in the water. I walked back to the head table where Richard stood frozen, his hands gripping the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles were white. The corporate attorney from Pacific Horizon had abandoned his position near the tree line and stepped forward, joining the lead developer at the front table. They were no longer looking at Richard with respect. They were looking at the parcel in my hands. In the world of high-stakes real estate development, unverified claims are an annoyance, but a sealed courthouse delivery is a lethal threat. I did not rush the execution. I pulled the red pull tab, tearing the heavy cardboard open. I slid the thick stack of documents out. The top page bore the official raised seal of the Hawaii State Circuit Court. Below it was the expedited certified report from the Independent Genetic Laboratory in Honolulu. I held the pages up, squaring the edges perfectly. This is the blow landing. This is the moment the tectonic plates finally fracture. I looked directly at the Pacific Horizon attorney. I read the bold header aloud, my voice steady and clinical, broadcasting the data with absolute clarity. Court-ordered analysis, I stated, letting the words hang in the humid air. Chain of custody verified and monitored by the Circuit Court of Hawaii. Tested materials include the preserved surgical tissue of David Gonzalez, extracted and maintained by the Hilo Medical Center Commercial Pathology Laboratory. The secondary sample is the blood of Elizabeth Gonzalez, drawn under court supervision. I paused, letting the undeniable weight of the legal and medical oversight register with every person on the lawn. This was not a document assembled in a private lab. This was the irrefutable truth backed by the full power of the state. I read the final conclusion. Probability of biological paternity is 99.9%. David Gonzalez is the biological father. I stepped away from the podium and handed the certified report directly to the Pacific Horizon attorney. He took the pages, his eyes scanning the raised seals, the judge's signature, and the laboratory authentication markers. I watched the color drain from his face. His professional detachment vanished, leaving behind the stark, terrifying realization that his firm was seconds away from purchasing a $40 million property from a man who had absolutely no legal right to sell it. The attorney looked at the lead developer and gave a single sharp nod. The title was fatally clouded. I returned to the head table. Richard was staring at the space where the document had been his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man watching the ocean recede, knowing the tsunami was already cresting. But I was not finished. The science exposed the biological lie, but the science did not explain the cruelty. The science did not explain the theft. I needed to expose the mechanics of the monster. I pulled the second document from the courthouse parcel. It was the aged yellowed paper Thomas's paralegals had discovered among Aunt Rosa's personal effects. The ink was faded, but the notary stamp from 29 years ago was perfectly legible. And this, I said, my voice dropping into a colder register, is a sworn contemporaneous statement by Rosa Gonzalez, David's legal wife, my biological mother. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The island elite who had known the Gonzalez family for decades, who had attended David's funeral, and who had whispered about the shameful affair child for years, were suddenly forced to confront a reality that defied everything they believed. I continued reading the core of the letter, amplifying Rosa's voice, ensuring her final confession reached the audience she had been too terrified to face while alive. This document names me as her daughter. It describes in detail how Richard used a grieving widow's vulnerability to steal her child. It outlines his threats. It details how he convinced her that acknowledging a living heir would trigger a protracted legal battle that would bankrupt the estate. It proves he forged a paternity affidavit 3 weeks after his own brother drowned in the ocean so he could inherit a massive ancestral trust that was never his to claim. I set the notarized letter down on the podium, covering the frayed, useless envelope I had delivered earlier. I turned my body to face Richard directly. The benevolent patriarch mask had completely melted away. The slick, charming exterior he used to navigate high society was gone. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, feral panic. I looked at him, and I did not feel anger. I felt the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a catastrophic failure. "You did not take in a mistake, Richard," I said, speaking clearly into the microphone. "You took a child. You told a grieving widow her own daughter would ruin the family if she ever spoke the truth. You isolated a mother under the same roof as her baby and forced her to watch you destroy my spirit. You labeled me a problem so your wife would hate me, ensuring I would never find an ally in my own home. You have spent 29 years punishing me for surviving what you did to my mother." The silence that followed was absolute. The accusation was total, and it was backed by bulletproof documentation. The defensive strategy Richard had deployed just minutes earlier, the claim that I was an unstable woman forging documents, collapsed entirely. He could not argue the chain of custody. He could not dispute a 30-year-old notarized confession. He was cornered with no legal or social exit available. When a narcissist loses control of the narrative, they do not surrender gracefully. They detonate. The last shred of Richard's self-control snapped. He lunged forward, gripping the edges of the podium. The microphone screeched with a harsh, violent burst of feedback, making several guests wince and cover their ears. "You ungrateful brat!" he roared, his voice echoing across the manicured lawn, stripped of all its usual polish. "This is my land. I built this empire. I managed the harvests. I secured the contracts. David was weak. He would have ruined the estate. I saved this family, and this is my property." He slammed his fist onto the koa wood table with staggering force. The crystal champagne flutes rattled, and one toppled over, spilling expensive wine across the white linen. The violent outburst shattered the elegant atmosphere of the luau. He was screaming now, completely unhinged. "You think a piece of paper changes anything? I am the owner. I am selling this estate, and you will not get a single cent." In his blind rage, he failed to realize what he was doing. He was not defending his innocence. He was screaming his justification. By shouting that David was weak and that he had built the empire, he was tacitly admitting he had stolen it. He was confirming the theft in front of 80 elite witnesses, the massive corporate buyers, and most importantly, the local press. The poetic retribution of the moment was profound. Richard had specifically invited the local media and a professional photographer to document his grand triumph. He wanted the island to witness him sealing the $40 million deal. Instead, the photographer who had been hired to capture his glory was standing near the front row. His camera raised his finger, holding down the shutter button. The rapid mechanical clicking of the lens captured every contorted feature of Richard's meltdown. The instrument of his vanity was actively recording his ruin. The press would have front-page photos of the respected patriarch confessing to a 30-year fraud. Sarah, standing near the overturned champagne flutes, finally broke her paralysis. She panicked, realizing her $20 million inheritance was evaporating in front of the cameras. "Security!" She shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "Someone get her out of here! Remove her from the property!" But her demand was entirely toothless. I was not an intruder. I was an invited guest. More importantly, the security guards hired for the evening were local men from the island. They had heard my accusation. They understood the implications of the court-ordered documents. They looked at Richard screaming at the podium, and they looked at me standing calmly with the paperwork. Not a single guard moved a muscle to intervene. They simply stood at their posts, watching the empire fall. I did not look at Sarah. I turned my attention to the other side of the table. Victoria did not scream at me. She did not call for security or rush to defend her husband. She stood perfectly still, staring at Richard as he continued to rant about his ownership of the land. I watched her face, and I saw 30 years of her life reorganize behind her eyes. Victoria rose from her chair at the far end of the head table. The movement was slow and deliberate, drawing the eyes of every guest on the lawn. For my entire life, she had been the unwavering enforcer of the Gonzalez estate, an immaculate matriarch who wore her status like armor. She had built her public persona around the narrative of the resilient wife who endured her husband's past indiscretion with quiet dignity. The island elite expected her to rally to his defense. They expected her to dismiss me to call security herself to protect the $40 million deal that would secure her luxurious retirement. I watched her stand, and I braced for the familiar icy glare that had frozen me out of family dinners and holiday photographs for nearly 3 decades. But she did not look at me with contempt. She looked down at the court-ordered genetic analysis resting on the podium. She looked at Rosa's notarized confession. Then she lifted her gaze and met my eyes. For the first time in 29 years, her face did not register cold dismissal. Her pristine, unbothered facade fractured. The rigid lines of her posture dissolved, and something profound and terrible broke behind her eyes. She turned her head slowly toward Richard. The raging patriarch was still gripping the edges of the podium chest, heaving, waiting for his wife to support his frantic defense. He reached a hand out to her, a silent command to join him in casting me out. She did not take his hand. She looked at the man she had been married to for over 30 years, as if he were a stranger wearing a stolen suit. When she spoke, her voice did not echo through the microphone. It was barely a whisper cutting through the dead silent tropical night, but the acoustics of the shocked crowd allowed every syllable to carry. "You told me she was your affair," she said. The words lacked any trace of the polished aloha spirit she usually projected. They were hollowed out, drained of all their previous certainty. Richard tried to interrupt, stepping toward her. "Victoria, we can fix this. She is manipulating the paper." Victoria held up a single trembling hand, stopping him in his tracks. She was not reacting to the revelation of infidelity. The certified science had just proven he never cheated on her. The phantom mistress never existed. Her marriage had been faithful, but the reality she was currently processing was infinitely more grotesque than a simple affair. "You made me hate a child," she continued, her voice gaining a sharp, brittle edge. "You brought an infant into my home and told me she was the living, breathing evidence of your betrayal. You knew my pride would never let me love her. You knew I would punish her for your sins. For 30 years, you used me." Her voice cracked on the final word. The psychological depth charge detonated right there on the manicured grass. She was not grieving the loss of her husband's fidelity or the collapse of their financial empire. She was grieving her own complicity. She was realizing that every cruel remark, every omitted invitation, every cold glance she had ever directed at me was not a righteous defense of her marriage. It was the exact tool Richard had designed to keep me isolated. She was the blunt instrument he wielded to punish his brother's orphaned daughter. He had turned her into the villain of my life so he could play the benevolent savior. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The mastermind who had controlled the narrative for decades was suffocating under the weight of his wife's realization. Victoria turned her back on him and faced me. She stood across the wreckage of the head table, the overturned champagne flutes, and the scattered speech notes lying between us. She did not reach out to me. She did not fall to her knees and beg for forgiveness. She retained enough self-awareness to know she was not entitled to absolution, and she did not insult me by asking for it. She simply looked at my face, taking in the features of the woman who had shared her roof, but never her home. "I believed him," she said, her tone stripped of all defense. I believed him because believing him was easier than looking at you and asking the hard questions. It was easier to be angry than to be curious. I am so sorry, Elizabeth. It was a stark, unadorned confession. It did not repair the decades of emotional starvation. It did not erase the lonely birthdays or the chilling isolation. It was not meant to fix anything. It was merely the truth delivered without conditions by a woman who had just discovered the foundation of her own cruelty was built on air. I stood in the torchlight and waited for the surge of vindication. I had spent countless hours during my childhood wishing for the day Victoria would finally apologize, wishing she would see me as worthy of her affection. Now the apology had arrived on a grand stage in front of the island's elite. But the emotion that swelled in my chest was not triumph. It was a shared, suffocating grief. I looked at her and I saw the tragic symmetry of our lives. We were two women who had been systematically manipulated and broken apart by the same man's boundless greed. He had stolen my identity, and he had stolen her humanity. We had spent decades regarding each other as enemies, when in reality we were both casualties of the same war. We were seeing each other clearly for the very first time across the debris of a fabricated life. The anger I had carried for her dissolved, replaced by a profound sorrow for the family we might have been if the truth had not been locked away in a fireproof safe. The raw emotional exposure of the moment hung over the lawn, suspending the 80 guests in a shocked paralysis. But corporate interests do not pause for family tragedies. The executives from Pacific Horizon were not there to witness a domestic reckoning. They were there to acquire prime Kona coastline. The sudden realization that the land they were about to purchase was tied up in a fraudulent title claim and an impending federal investigation severed their patience. The lead executive, a pragmatic businessman who had spent the evening sipping fine wine and nodding at Richard's grand promises, stepped away from his table. He did not bother to lower his voice. The polite facade of the mainland investor dropped away, revealing the ruthless calculus of high-stakes real estate. Richard the executive set his tone slicing through the humid air like a razor. He tossed his crumpled linen napkin onto the grass, a gesture of utter dismissal. If you dragged my firm into a clouded title negotiation while attempting to pass off a fraudulent heir claim, we will sue you into the sea. He did not wait for an explanation. He turned to his legal counsel and the rest of his development team and gave a sharp, commanding signal. "We are leaving," he announced. The developers stood up in unison. They gathered their briefcases and phones, abandoning their half-eaten meals and expensive drinks. They marched across the lawn toward the valet station, moving with urgent, coordinated efficiency. The $40 million deal, the luxury eco-resort, the golden future Richard and Sarah had been planning to finance their elite lifestyle, all of it evaporated in the time it took a businessman to discard a napkin. The sudden departure of the buyers broke the spell holding the rest of the crowd. The island elite, the local politicians, the neighbors who had clapped for Richard just 20 minutes earlier, began to murmur among themselves. They were witnessing the spectacular real-time collapse of a local dynasty, and no one wanted to be caught in the blast radius. Guests began to quietly gather their belongings, filtering toward the exits, leaving the glowing tiki torches behind. Richard stood alone at the center of the head table. The microphone was dead. The developers were gone. His wife had turned her back on him. He gripped the edge of the koa wood table, his knuckles bone white, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically from the departing crowd to the court orders resting on the podium. The empire he had stolen and maintained through 30 years of meticulous deception had been dismantled in under 5 minutes. The aftermath of a seismic event is often more revealing than the initial rupture. I did not stay to watch the tears fall. I did not linger at the head table to demand apologies or bask in the destruction of the men and women who had tormented me. There is a distinct cinematic power in a quiet exit. When you leave people alone with their wreckage, they are forced to look at the debris instead of projecting their anger onto the person who triggered the collapse. I reached forward and gathered my leather folio from the podium. I slid the certified genetic report and Rose's notarized confession back into the dark protective sleeve. I turned my back on the ruined centerpiece. I stepped off the manicured lawn and walked down the torch-lit path toward my car. The crushed gravel crunched softly beneath my shoes, marking a steady rhythm of departure. I did not look over my shoulder, but I heard the destruction unfolding in my wake. The sonic landscape of the luau transformed from a curated tropical paradise into a chaotic, disorganized collapse. Victoria's voice sliced through the humid air, stripped of all its polished hosting charm. She was demanding answers, shouting at the man she had blindly defended for 3 decades. Her tone was sharp and ragged, echoing the profound betrayal she was just beginning to process. Sarah was sobbing, a wet, frantic sound that carried near the overturned champagne flutes. She was watching her golden inheritance vanish down the driveway with the mainland developers, and she lacked the emotional tools to cope with a reality where she was not the center of the universe. The remaining guests were no longer standing in silent shock. A low buzzing murmur rose from the tables, swelling into a frantic hum. I could hear the distinct clicks and chimes of cell phone cameras capturing the disaster. Text message alerts pinged continuously across the lawn. The island gossip machine was firing on all cylinders, transmitting the scandal across the archipelago before the caterers could even clear the plates. Above all the noise, Richard's voice sounded harsh and hoarse. He was still barking orders, still insisting he built the coffee empire, still fighting a desperate war. He lost the moment the courier arrived. His arrogance refused to let him surrender, even as the ground swallowed his legacy whole. For 29 years, they told me I was a problem. They reminded me at every holiday dinner and every casual breakfast that my presence was an unfortunate burden they were forced to endure. Walking away from the fading torchlight, I realized they were entirely correct. I was a problem. But I was not the manifestation of infidelity or a shameful secret requiring daily management. I was a structural flaw in their grand design. I was a problem they could not solve a biological truth. They could not bury an orphan child. They could not unmake, no matter how many forged documents they filed with the county. They spent decades trying to compress my identity into a tiny, manageable box, but tectonic pressure always finds a release point. I reached my vehicle parked near the service entrance. I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, closing myself off from the noise of the ruined party. The heavy door shut with a solid, satisfying thud. I placed my hands on the steering wheel. They were perfectly steady. I sat in the dark interior and examined that steadiness. I made myself notice why the trembling had stopped. It was not the cold, calculated triumph I had braced for when I initially plotted this night. It was something much lighter and more profound. The desperate wanting was finally gone. The pathetic childhood ache that begged Richard to look at me the way he looked at Sarah evaporated somewhere between reading the courier delivery and hearing Victoria confess her manipulation. I stopped needing his validation when I watched his benevolent mask melt into feral panic. I stopped needing a seat at their table the second I realized the table was purchased with my stolen birthright. The psychological chains that bound me to their approval shattered, and the resulting freedom felt like drawing a breath of pure oxygen after years of suffocating in a sealed room. The central lie of my existence was that my worth had to be earned from the very people who profited from denying it. I believed I had to purchase my right to breathe their air by remaining small and compliant. I thought my value was something they possessed and rationed out in tiny, cruel increments. The truth is far simpler and far more beautiful. My mother named me the year I was born on a notarized piece of paper when I was an infant, unable to speak for myself. Rosa claimed me in writing despite the terrifying coercion raining down upon her from a ruthless brother-in-law. That single act of naming that quiet, desperate assertion of motherhood is worth infinitely more than 30 years of a stolen father's approval. Rosa fought for me in the only way she could, leaving a trail of evidence that would outlive her fear. I do not need Richard to validate my existence. I do not need Victoria to grant me permission to occupy space in this world. Rosa already secured my place. She paid the ultimate price to ensure I would one day know my true name. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life, filling the cabin with a low, steady vibration. I shifted into gear and drove away from the coast, heading back up the winding highway toward the mountains. I rolled the windows down, letting the crisp, cool volcanic air rush into the car. The sudden drop in temperature flushed out the cloying scent of the roasting pit and the expensive perfume that saturated the luau. The dark silhouette of the mountain loomed ahead, offering a harsh but honest sanctuary. Love built on a forged document and a stolen legacy is not love at all. It is a hostage situation dressed up in luxury and disguised as familial duty. They held my identity for ransom, using my own desire for connection as the lock on my cage. Tonight I paid my own ransom, and I paid my mother's ransom, using the one weapon they never thought I would deploy against them. I used the undeniable empirical truth she left behind in a wax-sealed envelope. As the elevation increased, the coastal lights faded in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was illuminated only by the sweep of my headlights carving a path through the dense tropical foliage. The anxiety that had plagued my preparation vanished, leaving behind a vast, uncharted landscape of possibility. I had walked into the epicenter of their deception and triggered the collapse without compromising my own integrity. I allowed the facts to execute the demolition. The estate would face a lengthy, grueling legal reckoning, but that was no longer my burden to carry. I had delivered the evidence. My role in their destruction was concluded. Now I had the task of rebuilding my own life on ground that I knew was solid. 6 months have passed since the night the torchlight illuminated the collapse of the Gonzalez Empire. The legal aftermath moved with a terrifying swiftness that Richard could not manipulate or control. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of gaslighting and emotional coercion, but he quickly discovered that you cannot gaslight a certified laboratory report. You cannot emotionally manipulate a chain of custody verified by the state circuit court. Paper trails and biological data are entirely immune to charm and intimidation. The judicial system processed the evidence with cold mechanical efficiency. Richard was formally stripped of his trusteeship within weeks. He is currently facing severe federal fraud charges alongside a sweeping civil suit for the orchestration of a stolen child. He sits in a holding cell, waiting for a trial that will publicly dissect every lie he ever told. The arrogant patriarch who built a fortress out of a stolen legacy is now locked inside a prison made of his own documented crimes. The social fallout on the island was swift and unforgiving. Sarah and Victoria packed their belongings and fled to the mainland shortly after the luau. Sarah lost the only identity she ever valued. Without the golden inheritance and the elite status, she was just an ordinary woman forced to face a world that did not care about her manufactured superiority. She vanished into the crowded anonymity of a mainland city. Victoria took a different path. Her departure was less of a retreat and more of an exile. She settled in a quiet town far from the ocean and the coffee groves. She writes to me sometimes. The envelopes arrive at my house bearing a simple mainland postmark lacking the embossed family crest she once favored. Inside the letters do not contain grand apologies or demands for forgiveness. They are usually just quiet observations about the weather or books she has read. I do not always answer her. Some months I place the unopened envelope in a desk drawer and let it sit there. But I do not throw them away either. I allow them to exist in that unresolved space. I have decided that is as far as my healing needs to go right now, and I have given myself permission to let that be enough. You do not have to fully forgive someone to stop carrying the weight of their actions. Taking possession of the Kona coffee estate was a surreal experience. Walking the grounds as the legally recognized biological heir of David Gonzalez felt like stepping into a life that had been suspended in amber for 29 years. But the transition of power brought a final, unexpected test. Once the title was cleared and registered exclusively in my name, the corporate vultures circled back. A rival development firm approached me. They were a much cleaner company than Pacific Horizon, boasting pristine environmental records and zero public scandals. They sat across from me in a sleek boardroom and slid a thick contract across the polished table. They offered me $40 million for the exact same parcel of land Richard had tried to sell. I sat in the plush leather chair and stared at the staggering number printed on the heavy paper. It was the exact prize that had corrupted Richard. It was the fortune that convinced a man to erase his brother and steal an infant. The money sat there offering me a lifetime of unimaginable luxury and boundless freedom. I could sign my name, take the $40 million, and disappear to anywhere in the world. I could leave the island, the trauma, and the dirt behind forever. I felt the gravitational pull of that immense wealth, and I understood for a fleeting second how a weak man could be consumed by it. But I also knew the true cost of that money. Taking the payout meant validating his greed. Inheriting his money would have meant inheriting his sin. It would have meant paving over the very soil my grandfather cultivated and erasing the history my mother died trying to protect. I looked at the developers, and I turned the offer down on the public record. I slid the contract back across the table and told them the land was no longer for sale at any price. I refused the temptation that made the monster, because the only way to truly defeat a cycle of toxic greed is to starve it of oxygen. Instead of selling the ancestral ground, I restructured the entire estate. I transitioned the sprawling acreage away from commercial exploitation and converted it into a model of sustainable indigenous coffee farming. I implemented practices that honored the original stewards of the land, focusing on environmental harmony rather than maximum yield. Most importantly, I retained every single local worker. The families whose livelihoods depended on the coffee groves kept their jobs, their homes, and their dignity. I made sure they knew their positions were secure and that they were valued partners in the operation, not just line items on a corporate ledger to be discarded. Then I took the final legal step to close the circle. I hired my attorney Thomas to draft a new property deed. The legal document defining the ownership of the Gonzalez Kona estate no longer lists Richard or Sarah. I instructed Thomas to officially register 3 names on the title. I put my mother, Rosa Gonzalez, on the deed right beside mine, and my father, David. The 3 of us own the land together now. The family that a greedy man kept apart through lies and intimidation is finally reunited on a single binding legal document. It is the only place we ever could be together, but it is permanent and it is untouchable. I did not quit my job. I still work as a seismologist at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory. I still drive up the mountain in the early hours of the morning to sit in the red glow of the crater. I still monitor the data and read the intense physical pressure of the Earth. But I no longer have to read the emotional pressure of my family. I no longer have to scan a dining room to gauge the subtle shifts in temperature or monitor the sharp glances of a resentful matriarch. I do not have to survive them anymore. My energy is dedicated entirely to the science of the ground beneath my feet. In the study of geology, we learn a profound truth about destruction and renewal. The most fertile soil on the entire planet is volcanic soil. It does not form through gentle, predictable weather. It requires total catastrophic destruction. It requires immense blistering heat and a complete violent reshaping of the physical ground. Everything that existed before is burned away and turned to ash. But what grows in that ash afterward is significantly stronger, deeper, and more resilient than anything that came before the eruption. The soil is rich with minerals born from the core of the earth, and the roots that take hold there are virtually indestructible. That is my story. It is the story of a dead woman holding a frayed envelope, waiting patiently inside a fireproof safe. It is the story of a fundamental truth that flatly refused to be buried under decades of deception. And it is the story of a daughter who finally learned that despite 30 years of being called a shameful mistake, her mother had loved her and proudly named her all along. I stand on the lanai of the Kona estate today and watch the sun dip below the Pacific Ocean. The coffee plants are thriving, rooted deep in the dark volcanic earth. The workers have gone home to their families, and the property is completely quiet. It is a different kind of quiet than the suffocating silence I grew up with. This is the quiet of true ownership. It is the peace of knowing exactly who I am and exactly what solid ground I stand on. I think about Rosa often when I look out over the fields. I think about the courage it took for a terrified, dying woman to leave a map for a daughter she was never allowed to hold. Looking back at the wreckage and the renewal, I realized that surviving a family like the one that stole me required learning truths they tried very hard to keep hidden. I paid a heavy psychological price for my education, but I walked away with 5 distinct lessons that I will carry for the rest of my life. First, I learned that shrinking yourself to keep the peace is not peace at all. It is simply funding the comfort of your abusers, using your own dignity as the currency. When you stay silent to avoid a sudden eruption, you are not preventing the damage. You are just absorbing the destructive impact entirely alone. Second, I learned that toxic people will weaponize your gratitude. They will steal your entire world and expect you to thank them for the occasional scrap they toss your way. You must never be grateful for the bare minimum tolerance offered by people who are actively keeping you trapped in the dark. Third, I learned that you can never out-argue a master manipulator, but you can always out-document them. Tears and screaming matches are the arenas where liars thrive. But they cannot gaslight a certified laboratory report, and they cannot emotionally manipulate a legal chain of custody. Keep your receipts secure, your paperwork, and let the cold, hard data execute the demolition. Fourth, I learned that true justice sometimes requires you to reject the exact prize that corrupted your enemies. I was offered the identical $40 million corporate payout that turned Richard into a monster. Taking that money would have validated his immense greed and poisoned my own future. Walking away from the financial temptation was the ultimate victory over his dark legacy. Finally, I learned that total destruction is not the end of your story. It is a terrifying transition, but it is often necessary. Just like the volcanic ash that feeds this beautiful island, sometimes your old life must burn completely to the ground before you can cultivate soil rich enough to sustain your true identity. What grows in the aftermath of that fire is infinitely stronger than the fragile lies that existed before it. You do not have to accept the role they assigned you. You are allowed to read the warning signs, break the old seals, and detonate the truth. Thank you for listening. If my journey resonated with you, or if you are currently holding your own sealed envelope, waiting for the right moment to open it, please share your experience in the comments below. I read every single one. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe to Sofia Told Stories. We feature the journeys of those who stopped keeping the toxic peace and finally reclaim their true names. Stay strong, trust your own data, and I will see you in the next story.